The moon, once thought to be a barren rock in the sky, had become the scene of humanity's greatest mysteries. Beneath its pale surface, hidden away from prying eyes, something unimaginable was brewing. A secret, one that could change the course of the war, and the fate of Earth, was waiting to be uncovered. Captain Daniel Morris, a seasoned soldier with a reputation for cold logic and unwavering loyalty, had never questioned the orders he received. His life was one of duty. Born into a military family, he had been groomed for this life since childhood. His father had been a war hero, and Daniel, eager to follow in his footsteps, joined the Space Corps at the first chance he got. Unlike most soldiers, Daniel wasn't driven by fame or glory. No, his motivations ran deeper. He was fighting for something more personal, redemption. In his early years, he had made a mistake, a costly one, and the guilt had haunted him ever since. His every mission, his every action, was a way to atone for that mistake. There was no room for error, no room for hesitation. He had to be perfect. However, deep down, a part of him longed for something more. He dreamed of a world where loyalty to his comrades and his superiors didn't come at the expense of his own humanity. But those thoughts were just whispers, his duty always drowned them out. It was the year 2157, and humanity had expanded its reach far beyond Earth. The moon, once a silent sentinel in the sky, was now home to a sprawling military base. The United Earth Forces, UEF, had established its headquarters there, conducting research, surveillance, and tactical operations in the ongoing war with an elusive enemy known only as the Silent Forces. These mysterious adversaries had been attacking human colonies on distant planets, and the war had dragged on for decades. The moon base was the last bastion of humanity's defense. Daniel's mission was simple: patrol and ensure the safety of the base. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential. The moon base sat in a desolate, dark part of the lunar surface, with the towering Earth looming in the distance, always visible in the sky. The surface of the moon, with its jagged craters and dark shadows, had always felt lifeless, almost as if it were holding its breath. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the base's machinery and the occasional transmissions from Earth. But that silence was deceptive. Beneath the surface, something was stirring. One fateful evening, Daniel's routine patrol took a turn he could never have predicted. While investigating an unexplained disturbance near the dark side of the moon, he stumbled upon something that didn't belong, an anomaly, a strange structure hidden deep within a cave system. It was unlike anything he had seen before. It didn't take long for Daniel to realize that this was no ordinary discovery. This was an enemy base. A hidden stronghold, buried in the moon's forgotten depths. As his boots crunched on the moon's barren soil, his heart raced. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of the discovery. What he had found wasn't just a threat, it was a game changer. He quickly sent a report back to command, but the response was chillingly brief: investigate further. We'll send backup. But as Daniel ventured deeper into the cave system, something shifted. A strange feeling crept over him, a sense of being watched, as if the very rocks around him were whispering secrets. He tried to shake it off, attributing it to the isolation and the eerie quiet of the moon's surface, but the feeling remained. Then, a voice crackled through his communicator. "Captain, we have a situation." It was Colonel Adams, his commanding officer. "The backup won't be coming. We've received orders to destroy the base immediately. Do not engage with the enemy. Return to base, now." Daniel paused. His mind raced. Something about this situation didn't add up. Why the sudden urgency to destroy the base? Why not investigate it more thoroughly? And why wasn't he being sent backup? A voice in his mind screamed, "This isn't right. There's something more to this." But duty called. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. Yet, the closer he got to the enemy base, the more doubts began to surface. Was this truly an enemy base? Or had he just discovered something far more dangerous, something that would change everything? As Daniel weighed his options, the ground beneath him trembled. A faint but unmistakable rumble. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a meteor strike. No. It was something else. Something alive. He backed away from the opening, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, the ground cracked open, and a shadowy figure emerged from the depths, an enemy soldier, cloaked in black armor, with eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The figure stood motionless, watching him. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice a mix of fear and authority. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, and Daniel instinctively raised his weapon. He fired, but the bullet didn't hit. The figure vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only an unsettling silence. The enemy had been waiting for him. They had known he would come. Now, Daniel stood at a crossroads. His mission had just turned from a simple reconnaissance to a life-or-death decision. Should he report the truth and risk everything, including the lives of his comrades? Or should he follow his orders and destroy the base, potentially leaving the enemy to regroup and launch a more devastating attack? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, as the echoes of his father's lessons filled his mind. Loyalty to the chain of command had always been his guiding principle. But survival, his own survival, had never been this much of a priority before. The clock was ticking, and Daniel knew that whatever decision he made, it would change the course of the war forever. And for him, the stakes had never been higher. In that moment of uncertainty, as Daniel stood alone on the cold lunar surface, a profound truth began to emerge. The moon, silent and indifferent, was no longer just a place of military strategy. It was a crucible, forging a soldier's fate. And as Daniel looked up at the earth, so distant yet so close, he realized that loyalty and survival were not always as clear-cut as they seemed. The journey ahead would be one of impossible choices, where each step could lead to redemption or damnation. The silence of the moon was broken by the distant hum of Daniel's equipment, the only sound that filled the emptiness around him. He stood at the entrance of the cave, his pulse racing as he thought about the choices ahead. The eerie quiet was overwhelming, almost suffocating. The darkened sky above seemed to close in on him, like the weight of an entire universe pushing him into a corner. Every instinct told him to turn back, to return to base, but something gnawed at him. The shadows within the cave, the glowing eyes of the figure, it all felt wrong. His mind was in chaos, torn between duty and the unsettling unknown that lay ahead. As he was about to retreat, the ground beneath his feet trembled again, this time more violently. A low rumble echoed through the cave, like a warning. Before Daniel could react, the cave floor cracked open. Dust and debris fell from above, and the air around him thickened with tension. His hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but his heart sank when he realized the strange figure was no longer alone. Emerging from the cracks in the ground were several more figures, silent, ghostly, their black armor reflecting the faint light from the cavern's glowing minerals. They were too many to ignore, and Daniel's mind raced with the realization that he was not alone. The enemy was closer than he had imagined. How had they hidden themselves all this time? His breath quickened. His communicator crackled again, the voice of Colonel Adams sharp in his ear. "Captain, do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. Return to base immediately. You are at risk." Daniel's eyes darted across the darkened expanse of the cave, feeling the weight of his mission pressing harder with every passing second. The figures were watching him, unmoving but attentive. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for him to make a mistake. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the fear of what might happen next. He knew the stakes. If he failed to report back, the UEF might never know the true scale of the threat. But if he followed his orders, if he simply turned around and left, he might be leaving something far worse behind. His hand shook as he gripped the communicator, ready to respond, but he stopped. The faintest whisper reached his ears, so soft, so distant that it almost seemed to be part of the wind. A voice, human, or something like it, calling his name. "Daniel." The voice was almost a whisper. But it was unmistakable. Daniel froze. His heart pounded in his chest. No one knew he was out here. He had been alone on this mission, and yet, someone was calling his name, hidden in the depths of this hostile world. His mind screamed for him to turn and leave, but his body betrayed him. Against all reason, he took a step forward. "Who's there?" he called, his voice barely audible in the deep silence. No answer. But the whisper returned, louder this time, echoing off the walls of the cave. It was a distorted version of his own name. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the ground beneath him shook once more, and he stumbled. He was no longer sure if he was hearing things or if someone, was truly out there. His eyes flicked to the dark silhouettes of the figures. They remained motionless, and yet Daniel could feel their watchful eyes on him, weighing him, judging him. The voice came again, and this time, it was clearer, more urgent. "Help me, Daniel. They're coming, please." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled. He wanted to scream. Wanted to ask who was out there, but the only thing that came out was a strangled breath. His heartbeat quickened, and his pulse roared in his ears. For a moment, he considered the possibility that he was hallucinating, perhaps the isolation, the stress, had finally gotten to him. But no, it felt too real. He reached for his gun again, but it was not the weapons he needed now. What had he just heard? Who was calling to him? Without thinking, his legs moved on their own, carrying him deeper into the cave. His instincts kicked in, urging him to find the source of the voice. He wasn't sure why, whether it was the desperation in the voice or the gnawing feeling that he was being pushed towards something monumental, but he could not turn back now. The deeper Daniel ventured, the stronger the presence of the figures grew. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and every step he took felt heavier. Sweat dripped down his face as his thoughts raced. Was this some kind of trap? Were the enemy trying to manipulate him, to lead him into their grasp? Or was this something far worse? Then, ahead of him, a faint light flickered from a hidden passageway. His eyes narrowed. It was as though the voice was guiding him toward it. He approached cautiously, every fiber of his being screaming for him to turn back. But the closer he got, the more the voice seemed to beckon him. It was only when he crossed the threshold into the new chamber that he finally understood. Before him, kneeling in the center of the cavern, was a figure, a human figure, with dark, matted hair and bloodshot eyes. It was a soldier, but not one Daniel recognized. The figure looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. "Help me," the soldier cried, struggling to stand. His clothes were torn, his face pale and gaunt. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, stepping forward, though every part of him screamed to stay away. I'm from the original mission. The one they sent out to investigate the base years ago. They left us here, abandoned us to die." The soldier's voice was frantic, laced with panic. Daniel's mind reeled. A lost mission? This soldier, he couldn't have survived out here alone for all this time. Could he? Suddenly, the figures that had surrounded Daniel began to move, slowly, deliberately, like predators closing in on their prey. The reality of the situation hit him in full force. They were not enemies to be fought, they were prisoners, just like him. "Run!" The soldier screamed, his voice breaking. "They're going to take you, too." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face the oncoming shadows, realizing that the true enemy wasn't just the silent forces. It was the unforgiving isolation of the moon itself, silent and relentless, watching, waiting, and now, it had its grip on him. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a prisoner in the same war that had claimed so many others. A decision had to be made, and there was no time left. The soldier's desperate warning echoed in Daniel's mind. "Run!" His heart raced as he looked at the approaching figures, shadows shifting in the dim light of the cave, closing in on him with chilling precision. His hand instinctively gripped his weapon tighter, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him, and his mind was clouded with uncertainty. There was no time to think. No time to hesitate. Daniel turned, bolting toward the narrow passageway he'd entered from. Behind him, the soldier's terrified voice shouted, "They're coming for you, too. You have to leave, now." He didn't have to be told twice. His boots pounded against the lunar dust as he sprinted through the winding tunnels of the cave. The dim lights from his helmet cast long shadows on the walls, and the air grew thicker, colder. The tremors underfoot grew more intense with every step. It felt as though the moon itself was fighting against him, each step, each breath, pulling him deeper into danger. With each twist and turn, the sounds of the figures behind him grew louder, footsteps, low murmurs, the haunting sound of something moving fast and just out of sight. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He had to get out. He had to survive. But his mind raced. Who were these figures? Why had they been waiting for him? And who was the soldier in the cavern? A part of him feared the truth, that this was no ordinary enemy. They were something darker, something far more complex. He didn't know how much time had passed as he ran, minutes, hours? Everything blurred. Sweat soaked his face as he rounded a corner and came to a sudden halt. Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. One narrow and cramped, the other wider and more open, leading down into a darker abyss. There was no choice. He picked the narrower path, praying it would lead him to safety. The seconds felt like hours. Every breath was a struggle, every sound a potential threat. His heart raced in time with his feet, but his thoughts kept straying back to the soldier. Could he have been telling the truth? Was Daniel really in danger of being captured? And why was he still alive? The narrow path was claustrophobic, the walls closing in on him, pushing him forward at a maddening pace. He stumbled, scraping his knee against the rocky surface. But the pain didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was survival. Every fiber of his being screamed to keep moving, to escape whatever haunted the moon's surface. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled again, and the passage seemed to collapse. Rocks rained down, forcing him to drop to the ground, his helmet smashing against the stone floor. He was disoriented, the world spinning, but he quickly scrambled to his feet. The sound of something crashing in the distance made him freeze. Something was getting closer. A flash of movement caught his eye. He didn't have time to react, something had darted past him in the darkness. A figure, but not a soldier. It was human, but distorted, like a shadow of a person. Daniel's hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but the figure was gone. He blinked, the fear and confusion creeping back into his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The tunnel ahead appeared to widen into a small cavern, but before he could make a move, the ground shook violently once more. This time, the tremor didn't stop. From the shadows emerged another figure, the same black armor he had seen before, its presence colder, more menacing. It was joined by several more of them, now closing in, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Daniel had no choice but to engage. He raised his weapon, pointing it at the closest figure, but before he could pull the trigger, a shrill voice echoed in the cavern. "Stop!" The figure stopped, frozen in its tracks, as if it had been commanded by someone. Daniel's eyes flicked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. Out of the shadows stepped another soldier, a woman, her armor similar to his but worn, weathered, and battered. Her face was pale, with dark circles beneath her eyes. She didn't look like the enemy. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, lowering his weapon slightly. His instincts told him to be cautious, but something about her presence felt different from the rest. "I'm not your enemy," she said, her voice steady but strained. "But if you don't listen to me, you'll be dead before you even understand what's happening." Daniel's gaze shifted from her to the figures standing motionless in the background. She wasn't one of them, she couldn't be. But the question lingered in the air. Who was she really? And why was she here? "You have to trust me," she said, her voice low, almost pleading. "They're not here to kill you, not yet, anyway. But they will if you don't come with me. You don't have time to ask questions." A part of Daniel wanted to refuse, to stay and fight. He was a soldier, he wasn't supposed to run. But the growing sense of danger, the quiet power of the figures standing still, waiting, was enough to make him reconsider. He needed answers, and the woman seemed like the only chance to get them. "Who are they?" he demanded, taking a step closer, lowering his weapon entirely now. "They're soldiers, like you," she replied, her eyes darkening as she glanced at the armored figures. "But they've been changed. Transformed. Something went wrong with the original mission. They were meant to infiltrate the base. But something happened. I don't even understand it all myself. But I know one thing, they don't think like we do anymore." The words hung in the air, more questions than answers. "Then why are they following you?" Daniel pressed. "They're not following me." The woman's voice trembled. "They think I can help them. But it's too late. The process has already started. We have to escape." Escape. It was the only word that mattered now. The ground shook again, a sudden blast of energy reverberating through the tunnel. Rocks fell around them, and Daniel's heart raced as he grabbed the woman's arm. "We have to go. Now." Without waiting for a response, he dragged her deeper into the cavern, hoping that whatever lay ahead was safer than the nightmare they were running from. Behind them, the figures moved again, silent, relentless, closing in. As they sprinted through the dark tunnels, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. And that whatever lay ahead was only going to get worse. The air felt heavier with each step Daniel took, his boots pounding against the moon's dusty surface as he and the woman sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors of the cave. Behind them, the distant thuds of the pursuing figures grew louder, more determined. The rumbling tremors from the unseen forces reverberated through the floor beneath him, creating a palpable sense of dread. Daniel's heart was a drumbeat in his chest, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. "We don't have much time," the woman called over her shoulder, her voice tight with urgency. Daniel's mind raced, overwhelmed by the chaos and confusion. The woman had said they weren't being chased to be killed, not yet. But something told him that if they didn't escape now, that yet would quickly turn into now. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed to make a choice, and it had to be the right one. Ahead, the narrow passageway opened into a massive chamber, its walls illuminated by strange, otherworldly light that seemed to pulse and hum with a life of its own. The walls of the cavern were lined with ancient alien symbols, their meanings lost to time, yet their presence unsettling. This place had not been built by humans, of that Daniel was certain. It was alien, and it held secrets, secrets that now felt dangerously close to swallowing them whole. Daniel's eyes flicked back to the woman as they entered the chamber. Her expression was grim, her eyes scanning the shadows. She was holding something, a small device, glowing faintly in her hand. "We have to get to the control room," she said quickly, her voice strained. "It's our only chance to stop them." Daniel's mind was spinning. Control room? Where? Why? Before he could ask, the tremors grew stronger, and the shadows in the cavern seemed to shift. The figures, those menacing, armored soldiers, were closing in fast. A few steps ahead, they emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on Daniel and the woman, their movements calculated and deliberate. The woman froze, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them. "They're here," she muttered, her grip tightening on the device. "There's no turning back now." Daniel's pulse quickened as the figures moved closer. He could see their black armor reflecting the faint light in the cavern, their features indistinguishable beneath the helmets. It was as though they were no longer fully human. Something had twisted them, changed them into something else entirely. "Stop!" Daniel shouted, raising his weapon. "Stay back!" The figures didn't respond. They continued advancing, their movements slow and deliberate, like hunters closing in on prey. Daniel's finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't bring himself to fire. Something held him back, a flicker of hesitation. The woman's warning echoed in his mind, "They're not here to kill you, not yet." "What do they want?" Daniel shouted, turning to the woman. They're not themselves, she replied urgently. They've been transformed by something inside this base. They can't be stopped by force alone. We need to shut it down before it's too late. Before Daniel could process her words, one of the figures lunged forward, its movements too fast to track. Daniel reacted instinctively, raising his weapon to fire, but the woman was quicker. She pressed a button on the device in her hand, and the chamber filled with a sharp, high-pitched hum. The figure stopped dead in its tracks, frozen mid-lunge. The others around it faltered, their movements jerky and uneven. It was as though the device had somehow interrupted their connection to whatever force controlled them. Now, the woman screamed, pushing Daniel forward. This is our chance. The urgency in her voice shattered Daniel's hesitation. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm and ran toward the far side of the chamber, where a large metallic door stood ajar. The figures were recovering, moving faster now, and Daniel knew that they didn't have much time. The woman slammed the device into a slot on the door panel, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. This way, she called, pushing Daniel through the threshold. They sprinted through the corridor, the sound of the figure's pursuit growing louder behind them. The woman didn't stop, didn't hesitate for a second. Daniel kept pace, his mind racing. What had she meant? What had transformed these soldiers? And what did she mean by shutting it down? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing: if they didn't reach the control room, they were both dead. Ahead, the passageway split into two paths. One path led deeper into the heart of the base, dark and foreboding. The other seemed to rise upward toward the surface, where Daniel knew the escape pods were located. But the woman didn't hesitate. She turned toward the dark path. They'll be waiting for us at the surface, she said urgently. We have to shut down the base first. Or it's all for nothing. Daniel's mind reeled. The woman's face was set in grim determination, her eyes fierce and focused. She was right. They couldn't run. Not yet. The stakes were too high. They reached a door at the end of the corridor, and the woman inserted another device into the panel. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a large control room filled with monitors, blinking lights, and rows of consoles. The hum of machines filled the air, creating a constant background noise that only heightened the tension. Without a word, the woman moved to one of the consoles and began typing furiously, her fingers moving faster than Daniel could follow. This is it, she said, her voice tight with concentration. I'm bypassing the system. If I can access the mainframe, I can shut it down. Daniel stood by the door, watching the shadows creep closer. He could hear the figures moving just outside, and he knew that they wouldn't give up without a fight. Suddenly, the woman's fingers froze over the console. Her face paled as she stared at the screen. No, this isn't right. They've locked me out, she said in disbelief. Lock her out? Who's locking you out? Daniel demanded, his voice rising in frustration. The woman's eyes widened with fear. They're controlling it. The ones who transformed these soldiers. They're still here. It's not just the base. It's the entire system, they're inside. Before Daniel could react, the door to the control room slammed shut. The figures had reached them. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, Daniel realized the truth. The fight for survival wasn't just about stopping the soldiers, it was about stopping the force behind the transformation. It was about shutting down everything that had brought them here. Do it, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the rising panic. We don't have much time. The woman nodded, her expression resolute. With one final, desperate move, she pressed a button on the console, and the entire room flickered. The lights dimmed, then went black. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, silence fell. The room was cloaked in darkness, the screens blinking out one by one, casting long shadows over the silent figures. For a moment, Daniel and the woman stood frozen, the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on them like an oppressive storm. The silence was deafening. The air, thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the lights flickered back to life. The hum of the machinery returned, but it was no longer the same. The systems, whatever force had once controlled them, had been severed. The cold, mechanical sounds that had once dominated the base now felt distant, muted. It was as if the lifeblood of the base had drained away, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Daniel blinked, his mind trying to process what had just happened. His heart pounded, but it was no longer out of fear. It was a different kind of adrenaline now, a rush of relief mixed with disbelief. Had they really done it? Had they actually stopped the unknown force that had controlled everything? Is it over? Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. The woman didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the console, her hands still hovering above the keys as if waiting for the next disaster to strike. Her face, usually composed, was drawn with exhaustion. But there was something else in her eyes now, something that spoke of quiet victory, tempered by the harsh toll the journey had taken. She exhaled slowly and turned to face him. "I think so," she said, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "The control systems have been shut down. The force controlling the soldiers, the machines, it's all been disrupted." Daniel's gaze swept around the control room, his mind still struggling to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had come so close to being overtaken by those figures, those transformed soldiers. The woman had risked everything to push that button, to disrupt the base's systems. And somehow, against all odds, they had succeeded. But even as the initial rush of victory washed over him, a sinking feeling tugged at Daniel's chest. It wasn't over yet. They had stopped the immediate threat, but the base was still a mystery, an alien structure that held more secrets than he could fathom. "What now?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now, less frantic. "How do we get out of here?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved toward the door, her expression tight. As she reached for the controls to open it, she hesitated. She turned to Daniel, her eyes locking onto his with a look that spoke volumes. "I don't know if we'll ever get out of here," she said softly. "We've stopped them for now, but I'm not sure if this is the end. The base, the technology, there's so much we still don't understand. And I'm not sure what consequences our actions will have." Daniel took a step toward her, his brow furrowed. He could feel the weight of her words sinking in. Despite their victory, there was a palpable sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. But he knew one thing, they had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm with determination. "We've already faced the worst, haven't we?" The woman nodded, but her gaze remained distant, as if something was still weighing heavily on her mind. She turned back to the door and pressed the controls again. The door slid open, revealing the dark corridor beyond. The faint glow of distant lights flickered in the distance, casting a soft, ethereal light along the walls. "Let's move," she said, stepping out into the hallway. As they walked, the tension in the air began to ease, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something even more dangerous. The base was massive, and the systems were complex. The control room had been one piece of the puzzle, but it felt as though there were so many more layers to uncover. Still, the woman's presence beside him was a steadying force. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from, but he trusted her. More importantly, they trusted each other now. They had been through hell together, and that bond was unbreakable. "So," Daniel said, breaking the silence. "What happens next?" She glanced at him, the corners of her mouth twitching in a semblance of a smile. "We find a way out of here. Together." As they continued through the corridors, Daniel couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. It wasn't just the tension that had subsided, it was something deeper. The battle they had just fought wasn't just physical. It had been a battle for their minds, their souls. They had fought not only to survive but to retain their humanity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. The farther they walked, the more Daniel realized that they had both changed in ways they couldn't yet understand. The weight of their actions, the choices they had made, would follow them. But that didn't mean they couldn't move forward. At last, they reached a small elevator shaft. It was old, battered, but functional. The woman moved toward it without hesitation, pressing a few buttons. The elevator doors groaned open, revealing a narrow platform. "After all this," Daniel said, stepping onto the platform, "we're going back up?" She gave him a wry smile. "What's the alternative? Stay down here with the ghosts?" Daniel chuckled, despite himself. It felt good to laugh, to share a moment of lightness amidst everything that had happened. As the elevator ascended, Daniel's thoughts began to wander. They had survived, but what would they do now? The threat had been neutralized for the time being, but there was still so much they didn't know. They had to figure out how to leave the moon, and how to deal with the consequences of their actions. The woman's words lingered in his mind, "I'm not sure if this is the end." The elevator hummed as it rose, the silence between them now comfortable, less filled with the sharp edge of fear. Finally, the doors opened. They were on the surface. The bright light of the moon's desolate landscape greeted them as they stepped out, the stars twinkling in the black sky above. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. They had made it. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. As they stood together in the cold, silent world, Daniel looked at the woman beside him, his companion in survival. Despite the uncertainty, despite the dangers ahead, he knew one thing with certainty: they were no longer just survivors. They were partners, and whatever came next, they would face it together. "Ready?" he asked, a new sense of purpose filling his voice. She turned to him, her eyes steady and unwavering. "Ready." Together, they stepped forward, their journey far from over, but no longer a journey they would face alone. The moon's surface was a barren expanse of gray, the vast emptiness stretching out in all directions. The faint glow of distant stars seemed so far away, yet they held a strange sense of closeness, as if watching over them. Daniel and the woman stood together, side by side, looking at the abandoned base in the distance. The control room, now a symbol of their struggle, loomed behind them. The silence of the lunar landscape felt almost peaceful in comparison to the chaos they had just endured. "So," Daniel said, breaking the stillness. "We made it." The woman, her expression softening, nodded. "Yes, we did." Her voice was tinged with exhaustion, but there was a quiet triumph in it as well. They had faced insurmountable odds, battled the darkness, and come out the other side stronger. Yet, the journey wasn't over. There was still so much left to figure out. They had stopped the threat that had been looming over them, but the future was uncertain. How would they return to Earth? What had they learned from their time on the moon? As they walked across the barren expanse, the airless surface of the moon beneath their boots felt surreal, like they were walking through a dream. The endless gray stretched before them, an alien world that had become their temporary home. And yet, as Daniel looked over at the woman, the strange feeling of being trapped, of being lost, began to fade. They had overcome the impossible. They had survived. What now? Daniel asked, the question hanging between them like a heavy weight. The answer seemed elusive, just beyond their reach. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced up at the horizon, where the Earth hung like a blue jewel in the black void of space. The sight of it filled her with a mixture of awe and melancholy. It seemed so far away now, yet within reach. "We find a way home," she said finally, her voice steady. "We don't know what's waiting for us when we get back, but we'll face it. Together." The words carried a weight, a promise. Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. They had been through hell together, and if they could survive that, they could survive anything. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, side by side. As they approached the remains of the lunar vehicle they had used to explore the moon, Daniel's thoughts turned to their next move. They needed to figure out how to return to Earth. The woman had mentioned a way to signal for help, but they didn't know how long it would take for rescue to arrive, or what kind of message they would send back. Their journey was far from over. "We'll need to patch this up," Daniel said, eyeing the battered lunar vehicle. I don't know how long it'll take to fix it, but it's our best shot at getting back to Earth. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and then smiled faintly. We'll manage. We always do. Together, they began working on the vehicle, using the tools they had left to make repairs. It wasn't easy, there were parts of it that were beyond saving, and the process was slow, but they didn't give up. Every time one of them felt like giving in, the other was there to push them forward. The hours seemed to melt away as they worked in tandem, their movements becoming more synchronized. It wasn't just about fixing the vehicle. It was about fixing themselves. About regaining control over their destiny. By the time they finished, the sun had risen, if you could call it sunrise on the moon. The pale light reflected off the lunar surface, casting long shadows behind them. They stood back, looking at the vehicle, now in working condition. It wasn't perfect, but it would get them home. Daniel felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered with uncertainty. It's ready. We just have to hope it holds up. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes meeting his. It will. We've come this far, haven't we? The words hit him with a sudden clarity. They had come this far. Not just physically, but emotionally. They had fought not just for survival but for something deeper, a connection, a purpose. Through all the hardship, they had found each other, and in doing so, had found the strength to carry on. You're right, Daniel said quietly, his voice firm with determination. We've made it this far, and we're not stopping now. With a final glance at the moon's surface, they climbed into the vehicle, sealing the hatch behind them. The vehicle hummed to life, and they began their journey toward Earth. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Daniel felt like they were truly in control of their fate. As the lunar vehicle began to move, the small screen inside flickered on, showing the route back to their landing site. The Earth was still a distant speck, but it was no longer just a symbol of isolation. It was a beacon. They hadn't just survived, they had learned. They had learned that survival wasn't just about the body, but the mind, the heart. They had learned the value of trust, of partnership, and of hope in the face of unimaginable odds. The journey had changed them. They had started as two strangers, thrust into a situation neither of them had chosen, but now, they were bound by something far stronger than mere circumstance. And as they sped toward the distant blue planet, Daniel's mind wandered to the future. The questions they still didn't have answers to, the dangers that still lay ahead, and the truth about the mysterious force that had controlled the base. There was still so much they didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't matter. They had survived. They were no longer trapped. The unknown didn't scare them. Looking over at the woman, Daniel felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The story of their survival, of their struggle and triumph, had already been written in the stars. And now, as they made their way back to Earth, Daniel knew one thing for certain, no matter where the journey took them, they would never be alone again.